6 months had passed since the day I walked into a Bennett Capital branch and wasn't recognized. Not as a CEO, not even as a customer, not even as a person worthy of respect. That day didn't just leave a mark on me, it changed how I understood leadership. I had built this company from a promise, but somewhere along the way, that promise got buried. Under policies, under numbers, under noise. I didn't release the video. I didn't call for firings. I didn't demand apologies. What I needed, what the company needed, was change that went deeper than damage control. And I knew it had to start with listening. So I packed a suitcase, cleared my schedule, and launched the Bennett Listening Tour. 57 branches, coast to coast. No press, no advance warning, no fancy introductions. I didn't come as the boss. I came as a learner. Because the truth is, if you're not close to the pain, you're probably too far from the solution. In Kansas City, I listened to a young teller speak about the fear she carried. The fear of losing her job if she ever spoke up about her manager's behavior toward immigrant customers. In Los Angeles, I met a janitor, 18 years with the company. He looked me in the eyes, tears forming, and said, "This is the first time a CEO has ever spoken to me." I didn't know I mattered. Some stories broke me. In Detroit, a single mother showed me 3 denied loan applications, all for amounts under $10,000. She just wanted to open a daycare center. The 4th time, I reviewed her file myself. She got her loan. But the truth is, she should have never needed me to step in. The system should have seen her, heard her, supported her. In Albuquerque, a retired veteran told me he felt like a burden every time he walked into a branch, until one young teller began greeting him by name. He said, it wasn't the money, it was the dignity. I left those meetings with a notebook full of scribbles and a heart full of weight. At night, in hotel rooms, I cried, I prayed, and I asked myself, was I too late? But in the morning, I got up and I kept going. Because real change is never convenient. It's hard, it's slow, and it's deeply personal. From those stories, we created Faces First, a quarterly practice in every branch, real listening circles, not surveys, not metrics, just people talking and being heard. We built the Bias Accountability Report, issued twice a year, not just to our board, but to the public. Transparency wasn't a strategy. It became our new standard. But not everyone welcomed the shift. In a closed-door meeting, 2 longtime executives challenged me. We're moving too fast, one said. Morale is suffering. Budgets are tight. Employees are tired of all this equity talk. I listened, I nodded, and then I said as calmly as I could, you don't have to like it, but if you can't lead with dignity, you can't lead here. That week, they resigned. I replaced them, not with external stars, but with 2 branch managers, people who had risen from within, who had led not from title, but from experience. I was done building towers. I wanted to build bridges. By the end of the year, Bennett Capital had promoted more women, more people of color, more first-generation college graduates than in any other year in our history. But those were just numbers. The moment that stayed with me wasn't in a boardroom. It was in a snow-covered town in rural Montana. I had visited a small branch. No one knew I was coming. No cameras, no speeches, just me. I stood in line. I waited. And when I reached the counter, a young teller looked up, startled. Her eyes widened. You're Olivia Bennett. I smiled, a little embarrassed. Yes, I am. She handed me a cup of coffee she had been drinking herself. We're proud to work for you, she said. Not because you're the CEO, but because you care enough to show up. That cup of coffee warmed more than my hands. It reminded me why I started. It reminded me what legacy truly means. Legacy isn't the buildings we name after ourselves. It's not the press releases, not the headlines. Legacy is what people whisper about you when you're not in the room. Legacy is who you lift up when no one is watching. And as I stepped back into the snow, steam rising from that paper cup, I knew this wasn't the end of a chapter. It was a beginning of a new standard, and we were ready to live it. Change is easy to announce, but oh, my dear, it's so much harder to live. By the time spring rolled around, Bennett Capital was no longer the same company it had been a year before. The name, still the same. The logo, still hanging proudly. But inside, where it truly mattered, it had changed. You could feel it in the way people spoke to one another. A gentleness that wasn't there before. You could see it in the way our customers were treated. With warmth, where there had once been coldness. With pause, where there had once been rush. But make no mistake, the work was far from over. One quiet morning, as I flipped through the bias accountability report, I came across a number that stopped me cold. Frontline employees were reporting a 43% rise in emotional exhaustion, and yet customer satisfaction was at an all-time high. I sat back, and I understood exactly what it meant. We were healing the customer experience, but we hadn't yet healed the people delivering it. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I listened. We opened up space, private forums, anonymous surveys, one-on-one conversations. And what came out wasn't loud or angry. No, it was quiet, gentle, but oh, so heavy. A shared fatigue, a sense that our people were carrying the burden of change. Alone, without enough tools, without enough support, without enough care for themselves. One branch manager in Baltimore said something I'll never forget. We're learning how to treat people better, but we're still learning how to treat ourselves better. That moment, it shifted something in me. Because setting a new standard for the world means we have to raise the standard of care for our own. So we launched the Compassion Culture Initiative. And no, it wasn't just a wellness program. It was a belief. It said that paid time off isn't a perk. It's a necessity. That emotional check-ins belong in leadership training. That mental health support shouldn't be buried in fine print. It should be on the walls of every break room. And more than anything, it was a way of saying to our team, you matter not just when you serve well, but because you are human. Some in the industry rolled their eyes. One competitor even laughed at a conference and said, Bennett Capital must be running a therapy center now. I smiled when I heard that, because deep down I knew we weren't just doing something bold. We were doing something human. And then came the letter from someone I hadn't heard from in years. Helen, the very first woman I ever hired, back when Bennett Capital was just a 2-room office in Chicago. She had been our receptionist. And now, in shaky handwriting, she wrote, Dear Olivia, I've been watching from afar. What you're doing, it matters. When I worked there, we were proud, but we didn't always feel seen. Thank you. You're making us proud again. I wept, not out of pride, but because in that moment, I realized what I had missed. Back then, in the race to build, I hadn't always paused to see. That letter led to something beautiful. I held a virtual town hall, but not for current employees, for the ones who had already retired. Anyone who had ever worked at Bennett Capital was welcome. Log in, call in, or send a letter, and the screen filled with gray hair, familiar faces, and a few old name badges still proudly worn. We didn't talk about profits. We talked about memories, kindness, regrets, and pride. One man said, I thought I was forgotten, but now I feel like I'm part of the story again. And he was right. They were part of the story. Every voice, past and present, deserved a place in the room. That December, I stood alone on the rooftop of our headquarters. The city below hummed with noise, but up there, it was still and peaceful. I thought of that young mother in Detroit, of the janitor in Los Angeles, of the retired veteran in Albuquerque, of the teller in Montana, and of Helen, our very first receptionist. And in the quiet of that moment, I whispered promise, not out loud, but in my heart. We will keep going. We will keep listening. We will keep choosing dignity, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Because legacy, it isn't what we build with brick and steel. It's what we leave behind in the hearts of others. And as I looked toward the future, I knew without a doubt, This wasn't just a new chapter, it was a new standard, and we were ready to live it. The news started slowly, an op-ed in a mid-sized business journal titled "The Bank That Listens." Then came the interviews, a segment on public radio, a podcast episode, and then a quiet clip of me, sitting in a folding chair in a branch lobby, listening to a customer story. That clip went viral. The caption read, "This is what leadership looks like." I hadn't planned on any of it. I didn't need a spotlight. I just wanted to be present. But sometimes, presence speaks louder than press releases. Soon, other institutions began to take notice. Executives from rival banks requested private meetings. Business schools invited me to speak. One even offered to create a case study on Bennett Capital's transformation, calling it a rare case of conscience meeting capitalism. I remember sitting at a long marble conference table in Manhattan, surrounded by suits and silence, when one bank chairman leaned in and asked me, "But does it scale?" I paused, then smiled. It scales if you mean it, because that was the truth. What we were doing wasn't strategy. It wasn't a campaign. It was a commitment. And commitments don't live in spreadsheets. They live in people. But with recognition came pressure. Every move we made was now being watched, dissected, doubted. For every article that praised our shift toward empathy, there was a thread questioning our efficiency. For every story of a transformed customer experience, there was a critique about profit margins. And then came the investors. A few began voicing concerns, gently at first, then more directly. Shouldn't we ease back on the listening sessions? Do we really need quarterly reporting on bias? Isn't it time to focus on the numbers again? One pulled me aside at a shareholders' dinner and said, "Olivia, you've made your point. Now it's time to get back to business." I looked him in the eyes and said, calmly but firmly, "This is the business now." Still, I never pretended to have all the answers. I knew change came with costs. I knew not everyone would stay on board. And I knew I had to be honest with my team, even when the truth was uncomfortable. So I called an all-hands meeting. Thousands of employees joined from branches across the country. I stood on that familiar stage under the soft lights and said, "We're being watched, not just by investors or the media, but by people who want to know if what we've said actually means something. And I'm here to tell you, it does. We're not backing down. We're building forward, not because it's easy, but because it's right." And then I paused. I could feel the silence, not tense, but alive, like every soul on the other side of the camera was leaning in. I continued, "Our model is working, maybe not in the way Wall Street measures, but look around. Customer retention is up, employee turnover is down, and more importantly, people feel seen. That's not a metric, that's a movement." That day, something shifted again, not in policy, but in spirit. It was no longer about me leading from the front. It was about all of us, leading from where we stood. And that's when the letters started coming in, from school teachers, from single moms, from pastors, veterans, even prison reform advocates. They had heard about the listening circles. They'd read about our internal reports being made public, and they were asking, "Can you help us do this in our world too?" A teacher from Tulsa wrote, "We have the same issues, invisibility, bias, exhaustion, but in the classroom. Your model gave me language for what I felt for years." A nurse in Cleveland said, "What you're doing in banking is what we need in healthcare, leadership that actually shows up." That's when I realized this was never just about a bank. It was about restoring dignity to the spaces where it had been forgotten. It was about rewriting the story of power, not as something you hold, but something you share. So we launched Voices Beyond, a mentorship and advisory program that brought our listening and equity practices into other sectors: education, nonprofits, even law enforcement. Not to teach, but to walk alongside, to share what we'd learned, to listen all over again. One Friday afternoon, I visited a high school in Philadelphia where a pilot of Voices Beyond was underway. I sat in a circle with students, teachers, and administrators and just listened At the end, a 16-year-old girl looked at me and said, "I didn't think people like you cared what people like me felt." She paused, then added softly, "Now I know you do." I walked out of that room and let the tears fall freely, not from sadness, but from hope, from a knowledge that change, real, messy, beautiful change, was no longer ours alone to carry. It was spreading. The news started slowly. An op-ed in a mid-sized business journal titled, "The Bank That Listens." Then came the interviews, a segment on public radio, a podcast episode, and then a quiet little video. Me sitting in a folding chair in a branch lobby, listening to a customer story. It went viral. The caption? "This is what leadership looks like." I hadn't planned on any of it. I didn't need a spotlight. I just wanted to be present. But sometimes, presence speaks louder than press releases. Soon, other institutions began to take notice. Executives from rival banks requested private meetings. University business schools reached out. One even offered to build a full case study on Bennett Capital's transformation, calling it a rare case of conscience meeting capitalism. I remember one meeting in Manhattan, sitting at a long marble conference table, surrounded by suits. One bank chairman leaned in and asked me, "But does it scale?" I paused. Then I smiled. "It scales if you mean it." Because that was the truth. What we were doing wasn't a strategy. It wasn't a campaign. It was a commitment. And commitments don't live in spreadsheets. They live in people. But with recognition came pressure. Every move we made, watched. Every word dissected. Every choice doubted. For every article that praised our shift toward empathy, there was a thread questioning our efficiency. For every story about better customer experience, there was a critique about profit margins. And then came the investors. At first, they voiced concerns gently. Then, more directly, shouldn't we ease back on the listening sessions? Do we really need quarterly bias reports? Isn't it time we focus on the numbers again? One even pulled me aside at a shareholders' dinner and said, "Olivia, you've made your point. Now it's time to get back to business." I looked him in the eyes and said calmly but firmly, "This is the business now." Still, I didn't pretend to have all the answers. I knew real change came with real costs. I knew not everyone would stay on board. And I knew I had to be honest with my team, even when it was uncomfortable. So I called an all-hands meeting. Thousands of employees joined from across the country. I stood on that familiar stage, under soft lights, and I said, "We're being watched, not just by investors or the media, but by people. People want to know if what we've said actually means something. And I'm here to tell you, it does. We're not backing down. We're building forward, not because it's easy, but because it's right." I paused, and in that silence, not tension, but something else, a presence, like every soul on the other side of the camera was leaning in. Then I said, "Our model is working. Maybe not the way Wall Street measures it, but look around. Customer retention is up, employee turnover is down, and most importantly, people feel seen. That's not a metric, that's a movement." That day, something shifted again, not in policy, but in spirit. It was no longer about me leading from the front. It was about all of us leading from where we stood. And then the letters started coming in, from school teachers, from single moms, from pastors, veterans, even prison reform advocates. They had heard about our listening circles. They had read our public reports. And they were asking, "Can you help us do this in our world too?" A teacher from Tulsa wrote, "We face the same issues, invisibility, bias, exhaustion, but in the classroom. Your model gave me the words for what I felt for years." A nurse in Cleveland said, "What you're doing in banking is exactly what we need in healthcare, leadership that actually shows up." That's when I realized this was never just about a bank. It was about restoring dignity to the places where it had been forgotten. It was about rewriting the story of power, not as something you hold, but something you share. So we launched Voices Beyond, a mentorship and advisory program that brought our listening and equity practices into other sectors: education, nonprofits, even law enforcement, not to teach, but to walk alongside, to share what we had learned, to listen all over again. One Friday afternoon, I visited a high school in Philadelphia where a pilot of Voices Beyond was underway. I sat in a circle with students, teachers, administrators, and I just listened. At the end, a 16-year-old girl looked at me and said, "I didn't think people like you cared what people like me felt." She paused, then added, "Now, I know you do." I walked out of that room and let the tears fall freely, not from sadness, but from hope, from a knowledge that change, real, messy, beautiful change, was no longer ours alone to carry. It was spreading. There are moments in a leader's life that don't make headlines. They don't come with applause or milestone charts. They arrive quietly, like a soft wind in the chest. And somehow, you just know, deep in your bones, that nothing after them will ever be quite the same. For me, that moment came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a promising partnership proposal for Voices Beyond, our outreach initiative. On paper, it was perfect. Expansion into 5 new cities, funding from a national nonprofit, endorsements from key community leaders. But in the middle of the stack, there was a memo, a quiet warning from a regional manager in one of our pilot cities. Staff burnout increasing, listening circles turning into venting sessions without follow-up, team morale declining. We're inspiring others, but we're running dry ourselves. I sat back. The wind had changed, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against my chest. Had we moved too fast? Had we built something so expansive that we forgot to check the foundation? I turned to the window. Outside, the trees were swaying. The wind moved them gently, but with purpose, just like change. Beautiful, necessary, but only sustainable if rooted deep. I closed the memo, stood up, and walked the halls of our headquarters. I greeted familiar faces. I asked how people were doing, really doing. Some smiled, some hesitated. One young analyst, barely out of college, looked me in the eye and said, "Honestly, I'm tired, but I don't want to disappoint you." And that was it. That was the moment it hit me. We had become a movement, yes, but in doing so, we had unknowingly created a pressure to be perfect, to always push, to never pause, even for ourselves. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about the single mom in Detroit, the veteran in Albuquerque, the students in Philadelphia. I thought about all the people we had touched, and all the people still waiting to be seen. And I thought about the cost, not just in dollars or hours, but in human spirit. At 3 a.m. in the stillness, I made a decision I never expected to make. I would step back, not from the mission, not from the heart of the work, but from the title, from the role of CEO. It wasn't defeat. It was stewardship. Because sometimes the most powerful act of leadership is knowing when to let go. The next morning, I gathered my executive team. There were gasps, protests, even tears. And I said, "I'm not leaving the work. I'm just making space. Space for new breath, new rhythm. We don't need a savior. We need a system that breathes." And then I added, "I built this to last beyond me. Now it's time to prove that it can." We began the transition slowly and with care. I handpicked an interim CEO from within, Rachel Kim, the former head of Midwest operations. Calm, brilliant, beloved by her teams. She had been one of the very first to adopt Faces First. She'd mentored dozens of rising leaders, quietly, without ever asking for recognition. Rachel didn't lead with charisma. She led with presence. And I knew she would carry the torch, not in my image, but in her own. In the weeks that followed, I took long walks. I journaled. I returned to the branches, not to manage, but simply to be. I sat in the lobbies again, anonymous, listening, smiling, breathing, and slowly, the wind inside me shifted. Not gone, not heavy, just present, like a current I no longer had to fight. One afternoon, I visited a branch in northern Vermont. tucked between a library and a bakery. The kind of place you could miss if you blinked. I watched as a young man helped an elderly customer with her statement. He knelt beside her wheelchair, spoke softly, patiently, and she looked up at him and said, "Thank you for seeing me." He smiled. That's our job. That's our job. Not profits, not perfection, but presence. As I walked back into the soft mountain breeze, I finally understood what that Tuesday memo had tried to say. The weight of change can't be carried alone. It must move like the wind, shared, responsive, free. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just leading a legacy. I was living it. The first morning I woke up without the title CEO in front of my name felt strange. Not empty, just quiet. No back-to-back meetings. No urgent memos. No calendar stacked to the minute. Just sunlight pouring through my kitchen window. A hot cup of coffee. And a silence I hadn't known in years. For the first time in a long time, I asked myself, what now? But the real question, the one that stirred deeper, wasn't about what, it was about why. Why had I done all this? What was left of it, now that I'd stepped down, now that the applause had faded? And that's when I realized the most important parts of what we build are the ones we no longer see. They live in others. They echo. They ripple. They remain. Weeks passed. Rachel Kim had stepped into the role with quiet confidence. The company didn't collapse. It didn't even tremble. And that, more than anything, told me I had done my job, not by holding it all together, but by letting others rise. I visited branches from time to time, unannounced, unnoticed, not to inspect, just to feel. And what I felt was steady, human, strong, not flawless, but full of heart. At a small location in Birmingham, Alabama, I saw a listening circle in session. A lone officer was speaking about his own biases and how they'd been challenged. No one interrupted. No one looked away. They simply listened. That moment, unscripted, unsupervised, unforced, that was everything. One crisp autumn day, I received a letter. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged in places. It was from a young woman named Celeste Marlowe, a junior analyst in Chicago. She'd been with the company just under a year. Dear MS, Bennett, I never met you in person, but I feel like I know you. When I joined Bennett Capital, I was nervous. I'm a first-generation college grad. No one in my family ever worked in banking. I thought I'd never belong. But in my first month, my supervisor asked me, "How are you doing, really?" And he meant it. Then we had a listening circle. And I shared something I'd never said out loud. I was afraid I'd be judged. Instead, someone across the table said, "I felt that too." That moment changed me. I just want to say thank you for building a place where people like me don't have to shrink to fit in. Sincerely, Celeste. I held that letter for a long time, not because it praised me, but because it proved something I had always hoped, that when we lead with humanity, we make room for others to be fully human. Too, in the quiet of my post-EO life, I began collecting stories, not the ones with headlines, but the ones like Celeste's, little moments, small changes, ripples in still water. I kept them in a wooden box on my bookshelf, handwritten notes, printed emails, photos of branch teams, a folded name tag for my very first employee badge. I called it What Remains, because in the end, it wasn't the awards that stayed with me, not the interviews, not the boardroom victories. What remained were faces, conversations, quiet cups of coffee, hands held across a desk, the warmth of being seen, the dignity of being heard. One December evening, I was invited to speak at a leadership symposium. I almost declined, but something in me said, go, not for the spotlight, but for the ones watching from the back of the room. When I took the stage, there were no flashy lights, no grand entrance, just me, a little older now, a little slower, but a lot fuller in heart. I looked out to sea of eager faces, some young, some seasoned, all waiting for answers. And I said this: leadership isn't about titles, it's about presence. It's not about being the loudest voice, it's about being the one who listens when everyone else is tired. It's not about changing the world all at once. It's about making one person feel seen and letting that moment grow roots. I used to think legacy was what you leave behind, but I've learned legacy is what you live quietly into the world while no one's watching. And when you're gone, it whispers through others. That's what remains. I walked off the stage to a standing ovation, but that's not what I remember. What I remember was the young woman in the lobby afterward. She came up to me, tears in her eyes, and said, "You reminded me why I want to lead." I smiled, touched her shoulder, and whispered, "Then start by listening. That's where everything begins."